Hello, I'm Scott Hartley. I'm the director of the truck driver training program at Caldwell Community College. Today we're going to be doing a pre-trip inspection on a Class A tractor and trailer. We'll start at the front of the vehicle and we'll do the inspect it, then we'll go under the hood. We'll inspect under the hood on the passenger side, then we'll go to the driver's side under the hood. We'll do all the brakes, tires, and suspension down the driver's side. We'll finish at the rear of the trailer, and if there's any special equipment on the passenger side of the vehicle, we'll inspect it also. We'll start at the front of the vehicle with the lights. I'd start at the top, and I'm going to check my clearance lights. I'm going to make sure they're clean. I'm going to make sure they're functioning. I'm going to make sure they're the proper color, which is amber. Then I'm going to come down to my headlights. I'm going to check my headlights, my low beams and my high beams. I'm going to make sure that they are clean and they're functioning properly. I'm going to check my left turn signal, my right turn signal, and my four-way flashers to make sure that they are functioning properly. I'm going to look underneath the vehicle to make sure there's not any leaks or anything coming from the engine compartment. I'm going to start on the passenger side under the hood of the engine. My windshield washer reservoir, it's full, it's securely mounted, not leaking. I'm going to check my exhaust. I'm going to make sure on my exhaust that I don't have any visible soot indicating a leak, that it's securely mounted. I'm going to check my coolant level. I'm going to make sure my coolant reservoir, that it's filled to the proper level. I'm going to make sure there's no leaking hoses, none of the clamps are loose, and it's all securely mounted. I'm going to check my alternator. I'm going to check the bolts on it to make sure that it's securely mounted. I would check my wires going to the alternator, that there's no frays or damage or bare wires are showing, and all of it's securely mounted. I would check my belt. It should have no more than 3/4 inch play. It should be securely mounted, no tires or worn indications on it. I would check my frame. I'm going to check my frame to make sure that there's no cracks or damages on it and no illegal welds. Okay, now we're going to inspect the driver's side of the engine compartment. I'll check my coolant again. I'm going to make sure that the reservoir on it's filled to the proper level. I'm going to check my coolant hoses on this side also. I'm going to make sure they are not leaking, that they're securely mounted, no bulges indicating that there may be a leak. I'm going to check my water pump. I'll check my water pump, make sure that it's not leaking, that it's securely mounted. I'm going to check my oil. I would pull my oil dipstick out. I would check it and make sure that it's not below the add level. If it is, I would add makeup oil to get it back to full. I'm going to check my air compressor. This air compressor is gear driven. I'm going to make sure that it's not leaking, that it's not missing any nuts or bolts, and it's securely mounted. I'm going to check my power steer reservoir to make sure that it's filled properly. If it wasn't, I would fill it to the proper level. I'm going to check my hose going to my power steering reservoir to make sure that it's securely mounted and not leaking. I'm going to check my steering shaft. I'd make sure that it's not loose, the U-joints are tight, that there's no missing parts on it. All right, I'm going to check my steering gearbox. I'm going to make sure that it's securely mounted, not missing any nuts and bolts. I would check my Pickman arm, drag link, tie rod, and the knuckle. I would make sure that they're not missing any nuts and bolts. They're securely mounted. I have castle nuts. I would make sure that they have cotter pins, keeping the castle nuts secure. I'm going to check my leaf springs. I'm going to make sure that they're not cracked or damaged or shifted. I'm going to check my U-bolts. I'm going to make sure that they're not missing any hardwire, that they're securely mounted, not broken. I'm going to check my leaf spring mounts, the front and the back. I'm going to make sure that they're securely mounted. They're not missing any nuts or bolts. I would check my shock absorber. I'm going to make sure that it's securely mounted, not missing any nuts or bolts, and that it is not leaking any fluid out of the shock. Now I'm going to move on to my brakes. Okay, I would check with the brake hoses and lines. I checked that the hoses and lines are not cracked, frayed, or leaking. I would check the brake chamber. I would check that the brake chamber is not leaking, cracked, or dented, that it's securely mounted and has no missing clamps or bands. Then I'm going to move on to the slack adjuster and the push rod. I'd check that the slack adjuster is securely mounted. I'd check the slack adjuster and push rod for bent, broken, loose, or missing parts. If brakes are released, push rods should not move more than approximately 1 inch if pulled by hand. Now I'm going to move on to the brake drums and linings. I will check that the drum has no cracks or excessive wear, no loose or missing parts, that the linings are not excessively worn or cracked, no grease or contaminants are on the drums and linings, and if it had rotors, I would check that the rotor is not cracked or excessively worn with no missing parts, and the disc pads are not excessively worn or cracked with no contaminants such as grease or oil. Okay, now I'm going to do an inspection of the tires. I do my TOP. I would check the tread depth, and on a steer tire it should be 4/32 or greater, and then it's evenly worn, and the overall condition of the tire and sidewalls has no cuts or bulges. I check the pressure at the undamaged and not leaking valve stem and cap with the tire gauge to the specs shown on the tire. I would check the rim. I'd check that the rim is not bent or cracked with no illegal welds. I would check the lug nuts. I'd check that the lug nuts are present, have no rust trails or shiny threads indicating looseness, and have no cracks radiating from the lug holes. I would check the hub oil seal. I'd check that the hub oil seal is missing no bolts and that is not leaking and filled to the proper level. Okay, now I'm going to do an inspection of the door. I'd check that the door is not damaged, that it opens and closes properly. I would check the rubber seal around the door to make sure that it's not torn or frayed. While I'm right here, I'm going to go ahead and check my emergency equipment. I'd check my BC10 fire extinguisher. It should be filled to the appropriate level. It should be securely mounted. I would check to make sure I had some extra fuses and breakers, and I would check my reflective triangles to make sure I had 3 of those. I would check my grab handle as I got in to make sure that it supports me. I would check my mirrors on the door and the mirrors on the hood to make sure that they are securely mounted. There's no illegal stickers, no cracks or damages on the mirrors. I'm going to move down to this light right here. This is a left turn signal. On the other side it'd be a right turn signal, and it is a flasher and it is a clearance light. I would check my steps on the tractor to make sure that they're securely mounted, they're not cracked, damaged, or broken, and would support me when I get on them. I would check my side box door. I'm going to check it the same way as I check the driver's door. I would check the rubber seal, make sure it opens and closes properly. I'm going to move back here. I'm going to check my fuel tank. I would check the lid, the cap on the fuel tank. I'm going to make sure that it's not leaking. I'd make sure that there's a rubber seal underneath it. I'm going to check and make sure that there's a safety chain. I'm going to check underneath the fuel tank, the lines and hoses going to and from the fuel tank to make sure that there's no leaks underneath on the fuel tank also. I'm going to check my air and electrical lines. I check that connectors are sealed and in good condition. I would check that the electric and air connections out of the truck and out of the trailer. I would check the glad hands are locked and in place and free of damage with undamaged O-rings in place, and the electrical plug is locked in. I'm going to check my catwalk and my steps. I check that the steps are solid and securely bolted, that they are free of debris or obstructions, and that the catwalk is bolted securely and free of foreign objects. I would check my drive shaft. I check that the drive shaft is not bent, twisted, or cracked, and that the U-joints are secure and free of foreign objects. On the exhaust system, I check the exhaust, that it's securely mounted, has no loose clamps or missing hardware, that there are no holes or leaks indicated by soot or rusty spots. On the frame, I check that the frame has no cracks, bends, or damage, no illegal welds or excessive rust. Now I'm going to check my springs, my airbag, and my shocks. I'm going to check that the springs are securely mounted, not missing leaves or bent, and I'm going to check that the airbag is not leaking and securely mounted, and I'm going to check that the shocks are securely mounted and at both ends and not leaking, bent, or broken. I'm going to check that the U-bolts are present with no missing bolts, not broken or cracked. I'm going to check the spring mounts, the air mounts, and the torque arm Check that the spring mounts and arrow mounts are not broken, cracked, or missing any hardware and securely mounted to the frame, that the torque arm is not twisted, bent, broken, loose, or missing hardware. We're going to check the springs, we're going to check the airbag, and we're going to check the shocks. We're going to check that the springs are securely mounted, not missing leaves or bent, that the airbags are not leaking and securely mounted, that the shocks are securely mounted at both ends and not leaking, bent, or broken. I'm going to check the U-bolts, that the U-bolts are present with no missing bolts and not broken or cracked. I'm going to check the spring mounts and the spring hangers and the torque arm. I'm going to check that the spring mounts and arrow mounts are not broken, cracked, or missing any hardware and securely mounted to the frame, and that the torque arm is not twisted, bent, broken, loose, or missing. Now we're going to do the brake inspection on this truck. This truck is equipped with disc brakes. We're going to check the brake hoses and lines. We're going to check that the hoses and lines are not cracked, frayed, or leaking. We're going to check the brake chamber. We're going to check that the brake chamber is not leaking, cracked, or dented, that it is securely mounted and has no missing clamps or bands. We're going to check on this truck with being disc brakes. We're going to check that the rotor is not cracked or excessively worn with no missing parts, and the disc pads are not excessively worn or cracked with no contaminants such as grease or oil. Okay, now we're going to do an inspection of the tires. We'll start with our TOP, tread, overall, and pressure. I check that the tread depth is 2/32 or greater, that they're evenly worn. Overall condition of tires and sidewalls have no cuts or bulges. I check that the pressure at the undamaged and not leaking valve stem and cap with the tire gauge to the specs shown on the tire. I would check my rims. I check that the rim is not bent or cracked with no illegal welds. I check my lug nuts. I check that the lug nuts are present, have no rust trails or shiny threads indicating looseness, and have no cracks radiating from the lug holes. I would check my axle seal. I'd have to take this chrome cap off. I check that the axle seal has no missing or loose bolts and that it is not leaking and filled to the appropriate level. These are bud wheels. I check that there is no damage to the spacers. On the bud space should be evenly spaced with no damaged or foreign objects. Okay, now we're going to do an inspection of the fifth wheel. We check the mounting bolts. We check that the mounting bolts for loose or missing bolts and make sure that there's bent or broken brackets. Our platform, we check platform for cracks or breaks, that it's securely mounted to the frame. Our locking jaws inside our skid plate, we check that the locking jaws are wrapped completely around the kingpin. The release arm and safety latch, we check that the release arm and safety latch are in the engaged position. And the fifth wheel skid plate right here, we check that the skid plate's properly greased and mounted to the platform and that the hardwire is securely mounted. When we get hooked to a trailer, we're going to check our clearance and check that the locking pins are fully engaged and that the fifth wheel is in position so the tractor frame will not hit the landing gear on the trailer. I'm going to check the kingpin on the trailer. I check that the kingpin is not cracked, bent, or damaged. I check the apron on the trailer. I check that the apron is no bent, broken, or damaged. I would check the gap between the apron and the fifth wheel. I check that there is no gap between the apron and the skid plate. On the back of the tractor, I'm going to check the lights. I have a left turn signal, a right turn signal. I have four-way flashers. I have clearance lights, brake lights, and reverse light. I'll check that lights and lenses are clean, proper color, and not missing or broken. I'm going to check the header board of the trailer. I'm going to make sure that it has no visible holes or damage so it keep the cargo secure. I'm going to check my clearance light at the top. I'm going to make sure that it's clean, functioning properly, and it's the proper color, which is amber. I'm going to check the lights and the lenses on the side of the trailer. I'm going to make sure they're clean, the proper color, which is amber, and they're not missing or broken. I'm going to check my frame rail, my trailer frame, down the side of the truck. I'm going to make sure that it's not bent or damaged or cracked. and I'm going to make sure I have DOT reflective tape on at least 50% of the trailer. I'm going to check my landing gear. I'm going to check that the landing gear is fully raised, that it has no missing parts, and the handle secure with the feet in the fully raised position, and there is no visible damage. And I'm going to make sure again that I have proper clearance from my landing gear to the frame of the truck. Right here on this side of the trailer, we have a left turn signal on this side. It'd be a right turn signal on the other side. This is also a clearance light and a four-way flasher. While I'm right here, I'd go ahead and check my underneath of my trailer. I would check my cross members and floors to make sure there's no damage or broken pieces on it. Now I'm going to do an inspection of the brakes, suspension, and tires of my trailer. I'm going to check that the springs are securely mounted and they're not missing any leaves or bent, that the airbags are not leaking and they're securely mounted, and that the shocks are securely mounted at both ends and not leaking, bent, or broken. On my springs, I'm going to check that the spring mounts and air mounts are not broken, they're cracked or missing any hardware and securely mounted to the frame, and that the torque arm is not twisted, bent, broken, or loose. I'm going to check the U-bolts. I'm going to check that the U-bolts are present with no missing bolts and not broken or cracked. Okay, now I'm going to do an inspection of my brakes. I check my brake hoses and lines. I check that the hoses and lines are not cracked, frayed, or leaking. I check my brake chamber, that the brake chamber is not leaking, cracked, or dented, that it's securely mounted and has no missing clamps or bands. I check my slack adjuster and push rod. I check that the slack adjuster is securely mounted. I check that the slack adjuster and push rod for bent, broken, loose, or missing parts. If brakes are released, push rod should not move more than approximately 1 inch if pulled by hand. Now we're going to do a check of the tires. We're going to do our TOP, tread, overall, and pressure. We'd check tread depth is 2/32 or greater, that it's evenly worn. Overall condition of tire and sidewalls have no cuts or bulges. We'd check pressure at an undamaged and not leaking valve stem and cap with a tire gauge to the spec shown on the tire. Our rims, we'd check that the rim is not bent, cracked, or with no illegal welds. Our lug nuts, we'd check that the lug nuts are present, have no rust, trails, or shiny threads indicating looseness, and have no cracks radiating from lug holes. Our hub oil seal. We check our hub oil seal. We check that the hub oil seal is missing no bolts, that it's not leaking, and filled to the proper level. These are bud wheels, so we check the bud space should be evenly spaced with no damage or foreign objects in between the tires. Now I'm going to check my frame and tandem release. I check that the trailer frame, again, has no bends, breaks, or missing rivets, that there's no missing cross member or holes in the trailer floor, that the tandem release arm is engaged, which is a button on this truck, and with the locking pins engaged, and they are. Now we're going to do an inspection of the splash guards. We check that the splash guards are not damaged and they are securely mounted with no missing hardware. I would check my ABS light. I would make sure that it's the proper color, which is amber. After starting the truck, if the ABS light comes on and stays on, that would indicate that there is a problem with the ABS system on the trailer. I'm at the rear of the trailer now. I'm going to check my clearance lights on the top. I would make sure that they are clean, they're securely mounted, they're the proper color, which is red. I'm going to move down to my door. I'm going to make sure my door hinges and rollers are all securely mounted, no damage, no broken, missing parts. I'm going to make sure my door shuts properly, and I'm going to make sure my door latches properly, that there's no missing nuts, bolts, or parts on that, and then it closes properly. Now I'm going to check the lights on the trailer. I'm going to do my LR4C. We've already done the C, which is the clearance lights. We have left turn signal, right turn signal, four-way flashers, and we also have brake lights, and these also are running lights also on the truck. Now I'm going to check my DOT bumper. I'm going to make sure my DOT bumper is securely mounted, not missing any nuts or bolts, and it has DOT reflective tape all the way across the bottom. I will check my tag to make sure it's securely mounted and that the tag light is working properly and not missing any parts or damage on it. And I would inspect the passenger side of the vehicle the same way as I did the driver's side. On this truck, there's no special equipment that we need to talk about on the passenger side. Now we're going to do an inspection of the lights. We'll do the back of the truck, the back of the trailer, and we'll also be doing the front of the truck. Now I'm checking my left turn signal. Now I'm checking my right turn signal. Now I'm checking my four-way flashers. Now I'm checking my brake lights. And now I'm checking my clearance lights. Now I'm checking my low beam headlights. Now I'm checking my high beam headlights. Now I'm checking my clearance lights. Now I'm checking my left turn signal. Now I'm checking my right turn signal. Now I'm checking my four-way flashers. Okay, now we're going to begin our in-cab inspection. First thing I would do when I got in the truck, I would put my seatbelt on. As I'm putting my seatbelt on, I'm going to check that the seatbelt has no cuts or damage or tires on my seatbelt. I'm going to make sure that my seatbelt latches properly and secure. Now I'm going to perform a safe start. I'd make sure that the truck is in neutral. I'm going to make sure my parking brake on the tractor and the trailer are applied. I'll mash the clutch in, turn the ignition switch on, let the gauges cycle. And start the truck. At this point here, I'm going to start on the outside, work my way in, then I'm going to come down the steering wheel and then go to the dash. So I check the mirrors. We check the mirrors on the outside, but while I'm sitting in the seat, I want to make sure that they're adjusted to me, both my door mirrors and my hood mirrors. I'm going to come over to my windshield. I'm going to make sure my windshield has no illegal stickers, no cracks or damage on my windshield. As I come down my windshield, I'm going to come to my wipers. I'm checking my rubbers on my wipers, make sure that they're proper tension on the windshield. There's no tires or damage on the wiper blades. I'm going to turn my wipers on to make sure they're working properly, and then I'm going to check my windshield washer fluid to make sure that it's working properly. Now I'm going to come down to my steering wheel. My steering wheel, I'm going to check my city horn and my air horn to make sure both of those are working properly. Now I'm going to move on to my dash. I'm going to make sure that my coolant temperature is rising to the appropriate temperature. I'm going to make sure my oil pressure gauge is rising to the appropriate oil pressure. I'm going to check both my primary and secondary air gauges to make sure that they're rising to the proper pressure. I'm going to check my voltmeter to make sure that my alternator is charging. It's at 14.1 volts, so it's charging properly. Now I'm going to check my indicator lights on my dash. So now I'm going to check my left turn signal, my right turn signal, my four-way flashers. I'm going to check my high beam light indicator. To do that, I have to turn my headlights on, and now my high beam light indicator is working properly. Now I'm going to move on over here to my climate control. I'm going to make sure both my heat and my air conditioner are working properly. I'm going to make sure when the fan's on that I have air coming out the top for the defroster. I'm going to make sure when I do that, feel the air coming out of the top. Then I'll move it back to the bottom to make sure that I have air coming out the bottom for my climate control. Okay, now I'm going to do my brake test. First, I'm going to check the trailer brakes. I would make sure that the truck is in neutral, my foot's on the brake, and I would release the tractor brakes. I'm going to disengage the clutch, put the truck in first gear, take my foot off the service brake. I'm going to put slight pressure on the trailer brakes to make sure they hold, and they do. Put my foot back on the service brake. I'm going to apply the tractor brake and release the trailer brake. Now I'm going to apply slight pressure by releasing the brakes on the tractor to make sure my tractor brakes hold. And the brakes hold. Now I'm going to check my service brake. I'm going to make sure that my trailer brake and my tractor brake are both released. The truck is in first gear. I'd roll 5 miles per hour to make sure the truck doesn't pull to the left or to the right. If the ABS light comes on, that would indicate that there is a problem in the anti-lock brake system, and I would need to have that checked. And I'm going to apply slight pressure on the service brake to make sure they hold. And it does. Now I'm going to do my lab test. I'm going to make sure the truck's in neutral, that I apply both the tractor and the trailer brakes, and I'm going to build the air pressure to do my brake lab test. Okay, we have full air pressure. The air dryer has hit the blow-off valve. So what we want to do now, we want to make sure that the truck is in first gear. We'll make sure we release both the tractor brake and the trailer brake. I want to turn the ignition switch to the off position. Then we want to make sure that we turn it back to the on position. All right, now we're waiting for all of our air brake system to settle, and it has. So we want to do the L part. We want to check for leaks. I'd put my foot on the brake pedal. On a combination vehicle, I should lose no more than 4 pounds of air in 60 seconds. Okay, now I'm going to do the alarm portion. I'm going to fan my brakes down to 60 pounds. I should get both an audible and a visible alarm. And I have both. I'm going to continue fanning my brakes to between 20 and 45 pounds, and the tractor brake button and the trailer brake button should pop out. And that completes my in-cab inspection.